Welcome. My name is Zach Ayer, and I'm the Education Manager for United World Wrestling, and certainly like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're in a series of coaching webinars designed on talking about how to design a practice plan. And so in the earlier webinars, we went through and discussed, what a practice plan is, why it's important to have one. We also looked at another webinar of how to reduce risk by effectively planning practice and looked at some strategies on how to do that. And then the last webinar, we took a look at the framework, the theoretical framework behind setting up a practice plan or a training plan, a training session. And so a lot of those things that we looked at are the things that I actually use on an everyday basis when I'm designing practices as we go. And today will be no different. What we're looking at today is our practice plan essentials. Like, what are the things that we need to have, or what are just some ideas of different parts that we can implement into practice? So we're going to be looking at a wide variety of things today. And what I probably would encourage you as we go through and do this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just a list of some ideas that you can use to help you design practice, and what are those activities that you do and how you implement those into your practice. And I think that one thing you're going to see as an overlying theme is going to be looking at the idea of being creative. What are some things that you're currently doing, and what are some things you could potentially add to your list for activities? So that's what we're taking a look at. Which, getting into our first part here, is this quote. And I think this is a great quote to get us started here. You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have. And I think when you're designing practices, a lot of times we get set in our ways of this is how it's been done, this is how it's always been done, and we don't necessarily always look for different things or different ideas to change up practice and to be more creative and to get more out of our practices. And I think that's one thing I want to encourage you to do as I go through a variety of different activities, is don't be afraid to start use this to allow you to think about how could you implement this, or what could you do even a little bit different than what I talk about that could implement and make your practice even that much better. So that's what we're going to look at. Again, you can't use up all your creativity. The more you use, the more you're going to get, and the more you're going to continue to think about how to make things better in this process. So here's what we're taking a look at today. What activities are in a practice plan? And here is a list of the different topics that I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about each one of these, and give you some ideas or some activities within each of these to help you design a better and more efficient practice plan. So we're going to be taking a look at what the warm-up is, what are some things you can do with the warm-up, then also different ways in which we can drill, teaching technique, which is something we actually talked about in one of the earlier webinars as well. Then live wrestling and different ways to implement that, strength and conditioning exercises, how to implement games and why that's important, and then just some end of practice activities that come up. So again, as we go through this, I'm going to give you some ideas, some suggestions. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list of here's the only things that can be done. But I would encourage you to, if any of these are new to you, great, give them a try, and hopefully as well something will spark a thought process and say, you know what, I like this, but I think I can implement this even better. And certainly that's what the goal of this is today, is to give you some ideas and some activities that you could use within your own practices. And I'll use some examples that I use within mine that vary a little bit from these as well. The first one here is the warm-up. And I think the one thing we have to keep in mind about the warm-up is really, what is the goal of the warm-up? I think there's a lot of things we can do to implement this, but remembering what the goal is will help you design that part of your practice. And so the goal of the warm-up is to slowly increase your heart rate, is to bring that level of heart rate up so it doesn't spike immediately when they get started. It's also designed to help loosen joints and prepare the muscles for activity. I think that, it depends on what age you're coaching, depends on how important this warm-up is. I know when I coach, I'm having a practice, and then I have my youngest kids in there at 7 years old, 6 years old. They don't need much warm up. Like, they are ready to go. Even just before practice starting, them running around, they're warmed up and ready to go. So I know that I don't have to spend a lot of time, as much time getting that done. But the older the athletes get, the more important that warm up is, because they have to get, they have to get their body ready to wrestle again, because they, especially when they get into the late 20s, early 30s, that warm up is really important. Even if you have an older group that's in there working out, practicing, that warm up is an important part of the practice. So here are a couple of different ways we can look at it. There's a part called a dynamic warm up and a static warm up. And a dynamic warm up is just referred to anything that's moving. So when we have a dynamic warm up, that process of getting warmed up is going to involve a lot of movement by that athlete. And really kind of break this down into three simple categories. One is standard warm up, which just involves some jogging and some wrestling specific drills. Then there's a gymnastics warm up where they do a little bit more tumbling across the practice area. And then a hybrid of both. And I would say if I'm looking at what I do, I probably do a little bit of a hybrid of both, like in my own practices. We do some jogging around the room. We do implement some wrestling specific drills at the beginning of practice. And then we do some tumbling, some gymnastics movements across the room as well, and as a part of this. And I think that, for me, that works well. I do know coaches that I've got one coach who I think he's one of the best coaches in our country. And he doesn't do a lot of tumbling. He does it gets right into some wrestling specific drills and does a lot more drills to get them warmed up versus like a stretching or jogging or rolling. That's how he does his warm-ups. And then recently I just had some coaches who got in contact with me who were listening to a college, another university coach speak. And he talked about the importance of doing gymnastics in practice, of just that process makes those wrestlers a better athlete. And if they become a better athlete, then they become a better wrestler. So he is more on the gymnastic side of it versus the other part. So I think that really this is a part that really just depends on you as a coach. What do you believe is the best type of warm up? I can tell you from personally, I use a little bit of both. We do some jogging, we do some wrestling drills, but we do find it important to do tumbling. And I know one thing we've been working on this year, at least, our leaders, our wrestling leaders in our room are going through the warm up. They're always like, all right, we're do something athletic. And we had some individuals who, made an attempt at a backflip early in this process, and it didn't go well for them. But they practiced it. We're doing it 2-3 times a week, and actually a couple of them have gotten really, really good at it and just become more athletic. So I encourage you to not be afraid to try some of those. The other type of warm-up you can have is a static warm-up. And this is one that I know I did growing up a lot. We did a lot of static stretching, which a lot more research has gone into keeping athletes moving to get them warmed up to get started with. But I do think there's an element in here that stretching can be important, particularly after maybe you do a dynamic warm-up and then you come back and do a little bit of stretching, or allow some of those wrestlers to stretch on their own. To loosen up or to stretch something that they need to. But that's referred to as a static warm-up. One thing that I would encourage, no matter which one you pick here, is number one, make this part of your routine. Like the warm-up should be part of your daily routine, and roughly probably the same amount of time on each day. And I'd even encourage you to be somewhat consistent with how your routine works, because if you constantly make big changes every time you do your warm-up, then you have to spend time teaching those aspects of it. And sometimes we don't really want to spend a lot of time going through teaching this. We want to just get them moving and get them loosened up and ready to get into practice. So if you constantly make big changes in it, then you have to spend time going through them. But if you make it kind of a routine where there's certain things you're doing in certain orders, I think that will help you maximize your time as well as, get the goal of the warm-up in. Now, beside this, I also listed creativity. Don't be afraid to be creative in this process. It doesn't mean you have to change the routine greatly, but you should vary it up from day to day. I know that we do a very set warm-up for probably the first 5 to 6 minutes. And then when we get into our wrestling specific drills that we're going to use as a warm-up as well, sometimes those drills change based on what we're working that day. So if we're going to be working some counter offense, some leg attack defense, then I'm going to have some drills that are more designed for that part of practice. That way we're kind of building into it a little bit, but we'll use those as our warm up as well. So be creative, change it up a little bit, but still make it a very similar routine from day to day. That would be my recommendation. The next one is implementing drilling. And when we talk about drilling is really that learning by muscle memory. In wrestling, you have to be able to just react without thinking about how to do something. And the only way to do that is to repeat that technique, that exercise, that action numerous times. And by doing it numerous times, allows them to just be able to react, do the technique, and they didn't have to think their way through that. Now, drilling, there's a lot of different aspects with this, and I'm going to go through some things. One thing to start off with is this can really be incorporated at any time during practice. It doesn't have to be at a set time. Like the warm-up is typically always at the beginning, and then some people follow a very regimented structure in terms of what they do. For me, drilling can occur really at any time throughout practice, and try to change that up as we go. So it's not always at the same time, because drilling can really be, it's a part that is a necessity for wrestling, because it's where you learn and get good repetitions and improve your technique. But it also can get very taxing sometimes on the wrestlers. It just gets boring. They get tired of hitting the same thing or doing the same thing over and over and over again. Despite we know how important it is, many wrestlers, after a while, they have a lower attention span. So just they have to get that change up. So, as we look at this, there's three main categories that I break drilling up into. The first one is basic drills. And I'm just going to list some basic drills, and keep in mind that some of these can fall into other categories as well. It depends on how we use these. All right. But basic drilling is just repeating the skills numerous times. So maybe we go in and we're going to work on double legs, just a double leg, like a tap and go, or just a quick setup to a double leg, and we finish it. And we're just going to repeat that over and over and over again. That's a basic drill. All right. This is the most common form of drills, and the wrestlers execute wrestling techniques that they've learned. This is done after new technique is taught to begin to build muscle memory with it. So a lot of times we do this right after we teach a technique. We teach it, we say, all right, now go back and drill it. So we see that happen very much, and I just can fall this under basic drilling. This can also be incorporated into more advanced wrestlers, where they might perform these at a match pace or with a more realistic wrestling feel, from their partner. So we try to do this, early we do some just basic drilling, and then as we begin to advance our basic drilling, then we start to try to operate this at a much more match pace, and we also try to operate this at a more realistic look. So the wrestler they're wrestling has to give them the look that they would typically see if they're wrestling a match. So some examples of drills that we do, that I do in my room practice-wise, we do a drill called hard in, easy out. And so hard in, easy out is where this is a more advanced drill where the partner gives that realistic look that requires the attacking wrestler to perform multiple skills to get an attack or a hold. Like they just don't let them shoot a double leg. They have to do a series of setups of moving their partner in order to be able to create an opening to get that attack. So it's a hard in, easy out. Now we call it easy out because once they get to that leg or once they get that hold, they're able to execute it with little resistance at that time. So we're just focusing on the front end of this, all right? But again, depends on what we're working. We might work a series of just here's the setup and then here's our leg attack as we go. Another one is called easy in, hard out. So it's the opposite of this. This one, we allow the wrestler to get the hold very quickly with limited effort. But then once they get that hold, then it becomes a very realistic feel at that point because the wrestler they're competing against is going to give them the realistic look of what it would take to actually finish that technique. And again, these are more advanced drilling because we've already learned it and we've already drilled it first. Now we're taking what we've learned and then implementing it into a more realistic setting. So easy and hard out, easy to get in, difficult to finish. I often refer to this a lot of practices. I give me a live look finish. I want a live look finish. They still get a finish, but you make them work for it to get there. Another way to implement some basic drilling is we do a lot of 3 or 4 person drilling. We call it 3-man drilling or 4-man drilling. And we just put wrestlers in groups of 3 or 4. And then one wrestler will go for a certain amount of time. And during that time, they'll perform the same action on each of the partners. So they'll go on the first partner, they'll do the technique, they'll go to the second partner, they'll do it, they'll go to the third partner, and then they repeat back to the first partner. And we typically go for a set amount of time. So this allows the drilling to be a little bit quicker paced and allows a person to kind of get, a very a high number of reps in a short amount of time. And because they're going against different people, they're going to get a little bit different feel each time in that process. And this is something that can also be built into other drills as well. But we do this, the 3 to 4 man drilling, and it's very good because it allows us to organize our groups of wrestlers by developmental stage and weight. So we already have those groups predetermined and allows us to get a high volume of reps in a short time. Another type of drill to take a look at is what I call technique drills. And these are drills that just focus on specific factors within a technique. So we're not repping all of the double legs, or we're not repping a single leg directly to a leg lace. We're working on a very individualized, very specific part of that technique. And this again allows us to get a lot of reps in a short time with just that technique to improve that skill. This allows the coach to kind of give immediate feedback just looking at one area, because we know sometimes if we have them drill the entire move that we show along with the finish, there might be 4 or 5 things that we really need to fix, but we can't fix 4 or 5 things at one time. We really can fix one thing, and then once we get that fixed, we can move to the second one. And so by doing more technique drills, we can really look at the specific parts and fix that before we move on to the next part. I think there's a lot of ways you can implement this. For example, we do this a lot at the beginning of practice right now because we're just working on our footwork, is we focus just on the penetration step. We're just working on knee over toe penetration step, or an outside step knee drop, or kind of a pulling shot. But we'll work on just those aspects separately. And then we'll implement those into that leg attack that we're doing with that penetration step. But we focus just drilling that part first before we move on to more advanced parts. So a technique drill can really allow you to narrow down and focus just on individual small parts of each of the techniques, which I think can be very helpful when you want them to be able to merge that into a much longer technique chain. Another type of drilling is conditioning drills. And these are exactly what they sound like. The emphasis is just on improving the conditioning of that wrestler. We're just trying to get them, in shape. I do this more than I do running. Like I'm not a big, I personally, coaching philosophy wise, am not a big advocate for running to get in shape to be able to wrestle. We do a lot of wrestling ourselves into shape, and we do a lot of conditioning drills. And during this time, we will also focus on the technique part of it, but the technique is not the goal of it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to fix if they're doing something wrong. I'm more concerned that if this is a conditioning drill that we're doing, we're going to spend time making sure we get a lot of reps in a very short amount of time and keep the pace moving, because I'm building conditioning while they're also working on technique. Now, once they're done, I might work on correcting an aspect of something I saw. But the reality is the goal of that drill was just for conditioning. Those 3 or 4 man drilling that I talked about earlier, sometimes we do that to get reps and to improve our technique. And sometimes we do that drill to improve our conditioning. It just kind of depends on what the goal is. If I want it to be conditioning based, I give them a very simple technique, and I just want that simple technique repeated multiple times as fast as they can to help build conditioning. Whereas if I want them to actually get a certain repetition, I really want them to get a good quality reps, but I want us to work on the technique, then it'll be a more complex technique where they have to work through more things. So it kind of depends on what the goal of your drilling is, depends on what you pick. One thing that I would encourage you to do is a lot of these drills can blend together, but whatever you decide to do drilling wise, get creative with it. Don't necessarily do the same thing all the time. Change it up from time to time on how you're going to emphasize the drilling. And you can implement that teaching of technique into that as you go, so you can kind of go back and forth a little bit. That's one of the things that I've spent more time doing recently has been, I'm going to, teach a little bit, and then we're going to go drill it. And I might have one person go for a minute, get as many as they can, go for the next person goes for a minute, call them back in, fix something, go back out and drill it again. And we just kind of keep that process going. So we intermix a lot of drilling and teaching of technique at the same time. But again, get creative, figure out what you can do to implement and make a drill that will work for you and what you want to accomplish. The next area here is how do we teach technique within practice? What are some different ways in which we can do that? This was covered in some earlier, in more detail earlier, one of the early webinars we had in the introduction to coaching and safety. We talked about what's the best strategies for implementing and teaching technique to your team. The first thing probably to make note of here is this is determined by you. There is more technique and wrestling technique out there than you can possibly imagine. And if you haven't, just go on YouTube, research, look up technique. You can find all kinds of drills. You can find all kinds of new ways to teach the same thing. Ultimately, you as a coach have to determine what's important for you and what do you want to teach. So first thing is establish what you want to teach and how you're going to teach that, in that process. Like, how are we going to work through the different situations and positions, and where are we going to hang our hat, when we go to wrestle. Once we have that, now we can look at the different ways to introduce the technique. And this is a little bit of review again from before. The first one we looked at here was identifying key factors. And this is the one that we spent most time on in the earlier webinar, because it's a really good way to do this. And I probably do this most often, especially when I'm teaching new technique to wrestlers. And this is breaking every technique down into key factors. What are the key things that require that action to be successful? And then once you've narrowed down what those points are, then you teach those points in very small increments. Like, I would never teach a technique with more than 2 to 3 key factors. Focus on 2 to 3, let them go out and practice and focus on those 2 to 3, bring it back in, add one more, let them go work on the 2 that you started with plus the 1, and you just build off of it. But identifying key factors is also you implement the process of identifying those key factors when you're teaching it to them, but you're also demonstrating that process as they go. And so this is a really effective way to teach technique, and particularly new technique. Another way to teach technique is just by demonstration only. Sometimes we can overcomplicate things by trying to give them so many details of what it is that we need them to do, but we could simply demonstrate the technique and say, all right, now you go give it a try and see how it works. And sometimes they may do it a little bit differently, but it may work better for them without having to worry so much about all the little points that go with it. This is particularly probably really good if you're running into a language barrier where you have people who maybe don't understand the language as well, and you're working with them as a coach. You have to find a way. So best times is just demonstrate what it is, and then you can allow them to try, then you can move them into the positions you need to improve that. So that's another way to teach technique. A third way here is by back design, or sometimes called reverse engineering. And that's essentially you start with the end in mind. So you start with what it is at the end that we want, how we want to finish this. And we work on the finish first, because sometimes that's the most difficult part. And then we slowly work backwards to get the whole technique and the whole chain list in. So we work backwards in that process. So that is another way to do that. A couple advanced ways, one more advanced way here is to incorporate this into situational wrestling. So you put them into a situation, you let them wrestle, then you correct and teach the technique they need to be successful to win that position. And then you let them keep wrestling, so you wrestle it, practice it, correct it, drill it, and then go back to wrestling it again. Because the wrestling is a lot about winning certain positions. And if there's certain positions that you need to be able to win and be effective in. And I think this is a really good way to implement, teaching and being successful in some of those areas, is by doing it through incorporation within situational wrestling. And the last way here, which is a more advanced way as well, is teaching technique through sparring. Sparring is a kind of like example of like play wrestling. Like, the wrestlers are just out wrestling and they're moving and they're doing everything they would normally do wrestling, but it's not necessarily a completely live situation. So there's a little bit of give and take in the process. And by doing that, they're going to start learning how to move their body a little better. And as a coach, if you're watching them go through this process, you can stop them at times, cover some areas that they can improve in, and then let them practice it and then let them get back to sparring again. So really it can change. So you're not dictating the position, you're just kind of looking to see what they're doing, and then you're fixing what they're doing in that process. So it's a little more realistic view. And again, that's a little bit more advanced topic, especially it depends on what level of wrestlers you have. But those are some just different ways to introduce technique. And again, this can be introduced throughout practice. Though I would say if you are going to introduce new technique and you're really going to add something to this that's new that they haven't done before, I would do it at the beginning of practice earlier, because their attention is going to be greater at the beginning of practice than it will be at the end. They're going to get tired and less likely to focus. So whatever you want to implement that's important, I would get that at the front end of practice. The next part here is live wrestling. Something that's going to be important in a part of a practice is where and when do you implement live wrestling. And before I get started, probably the one thing to make note of with this is there's a lot of coaches. I know a lot of coaches that will spend a lot of time, like they feel like they have a good team. They just like, all right, we're just going to wrestle live a lot, because that's going to help get them better. Keep in mind, I'm probably not on that end. I'm not that type of coach. For me, I find it more important. I want to drill way more than I want to wrestle. Like I want them to practice. I want them to learn the skills. I want them to get really good at it. And then we'll implement it into some live wrestling, but we're not going in every day and we're going to spend the entire practice time doing live wrestling every day for multiple days in a row. Like I just don't feel like that's going to be beneficial, because I do believe that you have to learn the technique and you have to drill it and get better at it. And there's never a time at any level of a career where you can say, you know what, I'm good enough. I don't need to go back and drill the basics. The basics are important, but I think there is a place and time where we can implement live wrestling into it. So I'll give you some ideas here. Now, the benefit about having live wrestling is it can benefit both the wrestler and the coach. The wrestler is going to get a chance to see, practice what they've been learning and see how they can implement that into a live situation, because it certainly is different when you're drilling it with little resistance and now you're trying to implement it into a live setting, which is why we try to do as much drilling as we can as a live look, so that way they're getting realistic looks the entire time. This also benefits the coach, because as a coach, you feel like you taught it well, they drilled it well, and now you get a chance to watch them try it out in live wrestling, and you'll find out very quickly, did it go well, or do you need to go back and fix some things? Because the one thing I've noticed that I've learned over coaching over the years is just because we taught it, we done repetitions with it, as soon as they get in that live set situation, sometimes they forget what they've learned and they go back to doing old habits. So how do we were able to see that when we get them out there and we do some live wrestling segments in practice. So I think it can benefit both if we're using it for that way. So what are some ways to incorporate live wrestling into practice? All right, so that's what I want to spend some time here, is what are some different ideas? Obviously, the first and easiest one is that 1 versus 1. You have two wrestlers, you match them up, and then you're going to wrestle for either a full match or a set length of time, but just 1v1. Probably what I spend more time on is I do a lot of group work, and I'll tell you why I do a lot of group work, but groups can be broken down into a variety of things. But I think it starts by grouping them into groups of 3 or 4. So you're putting 3 or 4 wrestlers together in a group, and you typically do this by developmental level and size. So that way you get your best wrestlers competing against your best wrestlers that are around the same weight. And purely from a risk management perspective, that is the way you want to do this. So we often predetermine who our groups of 3 and 4 are going to be before we even get to practice, because it saves time trying to figure out who's going to go where. But we put them into groups of 3 or 4, and some different ways that we can wrestle with this is, one is a round robin. And by what I mean by round robin is basically wrestlers will be in for 2 matches and then out for 1 or 2. So not everybody in the group is wrestling at the same time. So for example, if you have 3 wrestlers in your group, 1 and 2 will go out and wrestle for a certain amount of time. Then it will be 2 and 3 will wrestle, 1 will be out, and then it'll be 3 and 1 and 2 sits out. So essentially they're wrestling 2 matches and sitting 1. I like this format, particularly if you run into a space issue. Like if you don't have a big wrestling area for practice, but you have a lot of wrestlers, this is a good way to reduce the numbers of wrestlers that are wrestling live at one time, which is going to reduce your chances of injury of somebody falling on top of somebody else. When you have everybody going at one time, there's certainly the chance that there's less space, so there's less place for them to fall. You know, if you're looking a way to reduce the number of people on the mat wrestling live at one time, this is a good strategy for that. Another one that I've done as well is the Nordic format. That's just simply everybody that's in the group, everybody is wrestling at the same time, but with just different people. So if there's 4 people in a group, we'll put 1 and 2 together, and then 3 and 4 will be together. That'll be the first round. Then the second round might be 1 and 3 versus 2 and 4. So they just mix up partners as they go, but everybody's wrestling the whole time, but we're doing it within a group setting. And again, by doing it in a group setting, it really does reduce your transition times between goes. If you do 1 versus 1 and everybody has to find a new partner, then inevitably you're going to end up with the biggest guy and the smallest wrestler looking for partners, and they're the only 2 that are left out right now. Then it takes you time to switch people around to get people where you need to. If you already have them in groups, it reduces the amount of time you're spending at practice getting this organized. Another example of doing this in groups is what's called Shark Tank. And we do this with a lot of times with groups of 4. And so 1 wrestler is in, and all the wrestlers in the group will rotate against them. So 1 person will be in, it'll be 1 versus 2, then it'll be 1 versus 3, then it'll be 1 versus 4. And we'll do that for a set time and for so many goes. You know, because most of our matches are, you know, we wrestle 6 minutes, we will often do 6 1-minute goes. So we have 4 people in the group and they rotate against each person twice for 1 minute each go. Now, what this does is this doubles up multiple things here. 1, this gets them wrestling a full match, so it's working for conditioning. 2, it puts them in a very difficult situation because the wrestlers that are coming in are fresh, they've had a break, and now they're getting tired because they're going they're going for a total of 6 minutes where the others are only going 1 minute at a time. So they have to learn how to handle adversity and work through some discomfort and get tougher in that process. So we'll do this from time to time. It's not something we do every day. We'll sprinkle that in throughout time. But just if you do that type of process with a 6-minute go, you're looking at that activity is going to take you nearly 30 minutes to go through to get all 4 people and get 6 1-minute goes with each one of them. So again, you have to have some ample time to be able to do this as well. Another type of live wrestling is looking at situational wrestling. And so this is incorporating wrestling situations into the live session. And I think that we really can break this up into 2 types. The first one is positional. This is putting wrestlers in a specific position and then wrestling for a shorter amount of time. You know, for example, the wrestler would start with one wrestler would start with a single leg, and then we'd start with that single leg position, and then we just blow the whistle and we start, and it's a live wrestling situation. So, but whatever they need to do to score or to counter, and you're only going to go 15 to 20 seconds. You're going to give them a short amount of time to be able to finish that. So you can put wrestlers in different situations and then wrestle those live, like we talked about how to incorporate technique into live situational wrestling. That's the same process here. You just may not be spending a lot of time teaching in between those goes. But putting them in position is one way. The next one is a competition, and this is just taking wrestlers and putting them in situations that are going to challenge them mentally. So it's not like you have to win this specific position with, maybe it's in a front headlock position, or it's a single leg position, or maybe it's a parterre, you're in a gut wrench and you have 15 seconds to defend a gut wrench, whatever that is. This is where they challenge you. This is more challenging than mentally. They have to figure out how to win a situation. All right, so they have to come up with a solution for how they're going to win. So for example, we will often start wrestlers, we'll say, all right, we're up 1, down 1. One wrestler is up 1 point, one wrestler is down 1 point, and you have 20 seconds to go in the match. All right, so what's your strategy to get that takedown, maybe to get that step out, whatever that is? They have to have a strategy, but they have to formulate that, and so we're putting them in those positions. So this is what I would call competitive situational. Now I can tell you, I use these much more often than I use like the Shark Tank in that process, because that one's difficult and you can't do that all the time. But here we will spend time at different times, and sometimes we're just going to do positional live goes, and then sometimes we're going to do just competitive, or sometimes we intermix them for a series of time, and we're rotating. And we might do that within group work as well, because I had those groups before, and we're just rotating people within those groups doing positional, situational live wrestling. I'm a big group person just because I like the organization part of it, but I implement all of these things into that setting. Another option for a live match is to do what's called a grind match. And this is really just a live go for an extended amount of time. And I think the length that you can go has a lot to do with how experienced your wrestlers are. If they're not very experienced and they're new to the sport, I would not do this for any length of time. I would keep my goes relatively short. But if you've got wrestlers that have been wrestling for 10 or 15 years, now you just wanted to let them go out and we're just going to wrestle. And maybe we're going to wrestle a 10-minute match, or we're going to wrestle a 15-minute match, and we're just going to wrestle live for 15 minutes. And then and they're just going to go, and they'll continue to go through positions. They may be a little give and take in that process to avoid injuries, but they're going to wrestle for a long period of time. And you can even take that and divide that time into half, like, and say, all right, like, we're going to do a 15-minute go, and then 7.5 minutes into it, we're going to, change partners out. But again, that's something to do if you have more advanced wrestlers. You can look at that process. And like always, anytime you're looking at this, be creative. Come up with something that's going to work for you, and then figure out the time it's going to take as you implement this in. Again, just because I listed these doesn't mean these are the only ones. Like I said, I mentioned earlier here, I will often mix and match a lot of these into certain situations. So we may do like a Nordic format of something in a competitive situational. So we'll kind of blend all of these things together to what we need to reach that objective for that practice. Again, whatever your goals are that we talked about in the last webinar, you have to pick your activities that are going to help you reach that goal. And certainly live wrestling situations can help you get to that point. But again, don't be afraid to be creative and come up with your own idea that will work best for you and your situation. The next one here is looking at strength and conditioning. Like, how do we implement this into practice? The first thing I'd encourage you to do here is just start by making a list of the different activities that you can do. We did this in a course not too long ago, and I thought this was an excellent way. I was there with one of the educators, and he did exactly this. He took a chart and he drew up on a paper and said, all right, let's make a list of what we have and what we can do. So there's 4 quadrants. All right, so the top of the columns is either for general strength and chain conditioning or for wrestling specific. Because sometimes we just do things that aren't really wrestling specific exercises, but they help build strength and conditioning. And then we have wrestling specific areas where they do the same thing, but it's wrestling actions or wrestling activities that will help build those as well. Then on the side column, we broke it down into equipment versus no equipment. Some of you may have equipment in your room that will help you with strength and conditioning, where others of you may not have that. We have a variety of things, but not everything. But so we've got to be able to have something from everywhere. So I would start by making these categories and then start writing the things in the list based on that meets those requirements. So for example, if I'm looking for wrestling specific, I want to do something that's either strength or conditioning based that's wrestling specific, then here I'll look at the 2 things. If I have equipment, maybe I'll use some supplies, bags, Bulgarian bags, the Hertz training system, the throwing dummies, whatever they have. There's a lot of equipment that supplies makes that are very wrestling specific exercises that will help improve speed, strength, conditioning, and so on. All right, and so we may use that. But maybe we want to do wrestling specific, but we don't want to use equipment. All right, no problem. We can do 4-person drilling. That can also be used as a way to improve your conditioning. We do something in practice called match conditioning, where we spend time and we're hand fighting, we're moving the wrestler, and each wrestler is moving each other, and then I'll call out a simple technique, and then they have to hit it as fast as they can, in that process. And so we'll do it over the course of an entire match, like what a match would be, and then we'll take breaks at each time. And so we call that match conditioning. But I think there's a lot of things that you can do. And whether it's wrestling specific or general, there's a lot of activities that you probably have available to you, but you may have just never sat down and made a list of what you have and what you can do. So I would encourage you to make a list. That way, when you're designing your practice plans, you can pull from that list in those times that you need to. All right. An example here is looking at, here's some soufflés training. So here's just a short video here showing some of the activities that they can do. Some of these activities are going to be wrestling specific, and some of them are going to be female specific. And notice that this moment and there's one of our other development department coaches helping encourage let's go, find the people, come on, sprint. And so we can see there's a wide variety, and really there's a lot of equipment that they offer that can really be helpful with wrestling training and just training athletes in general. So if you have access to that, great. If you don't, it doesn't mean you can't still do those things. We don't have necessarily a lot of equipment like that in our room, but we do have some things. We have some kettlebells, we have some pull-up bars, etc., that we can use as well. So not everybody may have access to that. If you do, great, utilize what you have. One thing that I would always recommend implementing is some sort of circuit training. So you're working in maybe stations, maybe you're doing something called a Tabata, where you're on and then you're off for a short time, then back on and you're going full speed. Encourage implementing those things into practice. I'll give you a couple things that we do that I think are really, really good right now. We do a lot of Tabata training, particularly the second half of our season when we're getting closer to the bigger competitions. And we do this very much match time-wise. So like we kind of go for a match. Now in wrestling, most of our wrestling is short bursts. So you're wrestling, you're moving, and then all of a sudden you make an attack and you have to have a short burst and you have to get in there. You have to score really quickly and you got about 20 seconds. So we do a lot of 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. And we do this, and sometimes we do this, we set up and we'll have like 7 stations. And we'll just rotate with a partner. And sometimes we do wrestling specific activities. Maybe we just, wrap a double leg. We're not finishing the leg, we just wrap a double leg. Then maybe we're doing kind of a follow drill on top or a face drill on top. So we're doing things that are conditioning, but they're wrestling specific. And it's almost like we're wrestling a match. So we'll go 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and then we'll keep repeating and work our way through the stations. Other times we will do this as general training. So we'll use kettlebells, we'll use jump ropes, we'll use the pull-up bars, we'll do some ab workouts, so we do things that aren't wrestling specific, but we still do it on that 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and we rotate between the groups. And what I found is this has been extremely beneficial for us, particularly in getting in shape and getting prepared to wrestle not only one match, but multiple matches in a day. And I would encourage and recommend that to anybody who's looking for something new to do. I would come up with that idea. And certainly if you have any questions or have any follow-up questions, I'll be glad to cover those at the end here. The next aspect here is gamification. The first question that comes up, and we talked about this in one of the earlier webinars as well, but the question that comes up is, what is gamification? And gamification is the process of thinking and implementing games to engage wrestlers. Coaches need to look for ways to implement games and fun activities into practice. I think that's just an important part. Research has shown that games help develop skills and competencies. It provides feedback and practice for them and can be customized to an individual or to the group. So there's a lot of really good benefits to this. Now, the next one that comes up is what makes games so appealing? I think the video game industry has done a really good job with this, because I know that the students and the athletes that I'm around all the time, there's a lot of video game playing, whether it's on their phone, whether it's on a game console, whether it's on their computer. They're almost always playing games, and they like to do that. But why are they so appealing? Why do kids and athletes like to play games? Well, number one, I think we're in a certain situation now where, there's such a short attention span with them that they don't have a long time to go through things. So they don't like lengthy directions. I can tell you personally, being a teacher in the classroom, I really cut out direct instruction where I go up and I give them notes all the time. Like, what I found is that's not effective to learning. Like, it's better for me just to let them start giving it a try, and then I go around and help correct what they're doing. Games are much the same way. You don't have When they play video games, they don't get lengthy directions. They just pick it up and start playing. They'll figure out the rules along the way. They also, when they play the game, they don't have to get negative feedback. Sometimes as coaches, we're always quick to point out what they're doing wrong. Well, when they're playing a game, they're doing this, they know right away if it's not going well. So they don't have to get negative feedback because they know when they lose. All right. So I think we can implement games and they know, hey, I got to try a different strategy if I'm going to be successful. Also, games allow them to play with friends. One part about the gaming that's changed over the last 20 years, particularly video games, is before you had to have a console and you played by yourself. Now they're playing with multiple people, not only friends of theirs, but people all over the world. All right. So it makes it more fun when they're playing with other people. All right. And then I think one other part that's important with this is it just allows them some imaginations and creative thinking, allows them to come with their own solutions to be successful. So if you can implement games into this process, you're going to foster that type of thought process. Which goes to the next part. What are the benefits? Well, I mentioned some of the benefits already, but I think when you get into this, you find that wrestlers will be more motivated, they'll be more engaged, you'll actually get an increase in repetitions, it improves independent thinking, and allows them to learn by experience. All things of which are when you look at like retention from teaching, like these are all things that improve retention of anything that you're teaching. Now, we mentioned this, and I talked about this in the idea of discovery games. So this was one of our earlier webinars. We talked and just looked at really just what discovery games are in this process of gamification. And discovery games is a good way to really introduce new technique or introduce certain skills that you want your wrestlers to have. And you do so by playing a game. And the process of this works is that you basically come in and you give them, what the goal of the activity is. Like, the goal to win, here's what you have to do. You don't give them strategies on how to figure it out. You just tell them what the goal is and what it takes to win. Then you go through any safety measures that you may have. And then after that, you let them play. You just let them go out and see how they do the first time. It's probably not going to be great, but you let them just go out and experience it for themselves. After you've done it, then you come back and then you ask quality questions. So you ask questions, you allow them to give you answers, and you work towards the answers that you want to help improve their strategy, technique, or whatever that is. Then after you came up with those solutions together as a group, then you let them go back out and play again. And you can repeat this process as many times as you want. But this is often referred to as a discovery game because they're learning as they go and they're getting lots of repetitions. So I think there's a lot of great benefits from this as we go. The one thing is, as always, be creative. Like, take drills that you're doing and find a way to make it into a game. And some simple strategy to follow with this is really, if you just follow these things, number one, you set a goal, like what's the goal of the activity? Determine the developmental stage of the group. So once you know what developmental stage, you can best fit that game to that group. All right, then design the game. What are the instructions you're going to give them? What are the key points it takes to win? That you want to stress, and then what safety concerns do you have to address with them if there are any? And then lastly, you just got to be flexible. Like, if you try it and it's not working, don't be afraid to adjust it again. But don't look at it and say, well, that didn't work, I'm not going to do that again. Just look and say, how could I do it better? And how can I fix it? I heard somebody, I was listening to a course online over the summer, and this was really interesting. So it was about basketball. And this basketball coach said, they always had to do a lot of running. They're doing sprints up and down the court. And the athletes they hated it. They know it's part of it, but they just didn't like doing it. And they never gave that great of effort while they were doing it. So they would do a sprint where they go run and touch the free throw line, come back. Then they go to half court, come back, go to the other free throw line, back, and then the in line and back. And they would have to do so many of these. So, and it was always a struggle, he said, to get them to do this and to work hard. So what he did is he actually said, all right, you know what does every kid like to do? They like to play tag. So he went in and said, all right, here's the rules. Everybody has to stay within the court, and you're it. Go. And it was tag. And those people had to try to tag the others. And now he did say is if you get tagged, then you got to come out. Then you got to come over here and you got to do this running. So you're going to do the running we just talked about, the half court and back and so on. And he said, what they found is by implementing this game, because they loved it. And they started wanting to have this at practice. And he said, what he got out of this was, he said, you know what? I got everything I needed to accomplish in 10 minutes. I got the running that I needed him to do, the sprinting, the stopping and going, gave everything they needed to do in 10 minutes, and they had fun doing it, and they want to keep doing it. So he accomplished the same exact goal, but did it in a game format. And now their athletes were like, hey, can we play tag again today? And I think there's so many ways that we can implement some of these activities and make them fun, and we'll encourage and want them to keep doing it. I think that's a part sometimes we think as a wrestling coaches, oh, it's got to be hard, it's got to be tough, we got to grind, we got to make them work really hard to get really good. I think there's ways to get them to work really hard and to still have fun. And if they still have fun, they still want to do it at the end. And the key is having them want to keep doing this. And that's what I love about this picture that you see on here. I know this little boy right now, I'm not sure what he's doing, but he is having fun. There's a smile on his face. And what I can tell you is he's coming back the next day, and he's going to keep coming back the next day because he's enjoying it. The last one here is the end of practice. What do we do once practice finishes up and how we wrap this up? One of the things we need to make sure we have in there and build in is a cool down. And again, what is the goal of a cool down? The cool down is to lower the heart rate, improve flexibility, and prevent injuries. And so we can do that by gradually decreasing that level of activity or getting into some lighter activities that allow that to happen. I know for us this year, we're going to spend a lot of time after practice doing some stretching and doing some yoga to help improve our flexibility in that process, which in turn will also help lower our heart rate slower, and also will help prevent injury. So we're going to implement more of that into our practices as we get started. But it's important to have a cool down built into that so they just don't abruptly end practice. Another important time is this is where you have your post-practice comments. Here's your time as a coach. You're going to be addressing your team on a potential variety of topics. How do you do that? What do you do? What do you say or how do you say it? So here are a few things that I would recommend as a coach that I think would be a good strategy for giving quality post-practice comments. Number one, highlight excellent performances. If you find somebody who did a phenomenal job at practice, celebrate them in front of their team. Nothing motivates anybody more than positive comments in front of an entire group. I mean, who doesn't like to get praised in front of their peers? There's nobody. Everybody likes that coming from somebody else. So highlight the excellent performances you see around the room. That is way more motivational for them to keep doing it, and for others to say, hey, I want to be that person that gets recognized in front of the group. It's better than doing the opposite of finding and criticizing somebody's performance. If you need to address an area of improvement, do it as a team, as a whole team. Don't do it individually. Don't say, well, Johnny, you need to work on this, and Sally, you need to do this. Collectively, as a whole team, we need to improve in this area. So address only team concerns, not individual concerns. If you have an individual concern, do that privately. Don't do that at your post-practice comments. The next one, this is a great opportunity to reinforce mental, communication, and character skills. We know as participating in a sport that there is more to wrestling. It's about becoming a better person along the way. Not every wrestler you coach is going to go on to be an Olympic champion or a district champion or national champion. Sometimes they're participating in the sport because they're going to become a better person for having done that. So we need to make sure that we take time to reinforce those soft skills that not only improve you as a wrestler, but improve you as a person. So that's just as important. And this is a great time to make sure that you cover these areas. Any general announcements for the team, like when the next practice is, if you have a competition coming up, what that time schedule is. There's a lot of things that you can make some general announcements typically do that at the end of practice as well. And lastly, what I would end with here is this: your post-practice comments really need to be a positive experience. This is the last thing that your athletes are going to remember when they walk out the door. Do you want them to leave angry? Do you want them to leave with a positive experience and more motivating, ready to come back and get after it either later or the next day or a couple days from there? But I would make this a positive experience. So that way it's upbeat. They're leaving with a good memory of that activity. And in that way they're ready to come back the next day. Because if they leave with a negative experience, it often takes it takes a long time for them to recover from that, when we can make sure it's easy for us to make sure they leave with a more positive experience. So those are just some things that I would encourage as we go through this. If anybody has additional questions, I'd be glad to answer these at any time or give some examples of what I do collectively be glad to go through anything that I've done personally in my class, in my practices, that may be helpful as well. All right, Rusty had mentioned here earlier that anytime you're introducing like back flip, back handsprings, just a lot of like throwing kind of activities, one, you can do this with partners to help you be able to get those and to get that feeling for it, which is really good. We've done that as well. And then also, getting crash pads, like particularly for throwing and for big high amplitude activities, it's good to be able to do that onto a softer mat surface. So if you have those ability, certainly do that. I know we do that when we get into certain activities, when we get into throwing or some big double legs that we're rotating through the air, we'll have them land them on the crash pad. That way it's safer for the wrestler to be there. And again, as he mentioned here, it helps overcome some fears. So I think that's good. All right, I don't see any other questions. I'll kind of finish with this. One thing I would encourage is to be creative in this. Like, I went through and just gave you some examples of things ways that you can implement these different parts of practice into your plan. You have to design a plan, and every day is going to look a little bit different. But don't be afraid to be creative with what you're doing. And I really like this quote. It says, just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it is not possible. I think that's one thing I feel like as a coach that I've really grown in the last 3 to 4 years. And I'm lucky to have good assistant coaches. So we will have conversations on rides and say, what are we doing and how can we do this differently? How can we implement a drill? How can we implement live wrestling? How can we implement this different than what we're currently doing? And as a result, we came up with some different strategies for how to run practice that I think have helped our athletes grow during the time that we have them. So I'd encourage you that if you're looking at this list and you made a list of this and you go back later and watch this and you're writing down some of these, hey, this is a great starting point, but don't be afraid to get outside the box and say, okay, here's my situation. Here's the athletes I have. Here's what I want to accomplish. How can I do that? And if you do that, I think you'll find that you'll be able to have some, really a great success, and that creativity will just continue to go from there. Now, finishing up, we have one more webinar in this series, which will happen in a couple of weeks. It probably will not be on a Monday, just because I know I've got a conflict with time on that day. So it may be on Tuesday in a couple of weeks. But we'll kind of look at how to pull everything together and just what are some things we need to have in our practice plans as we're starting to make these. Because really, we're not giving you how to make the practice plan. We're just giving you the ideas, the concepts, and the things. And then you have to design and build your own. And the more you do that, the easier these will become over time. But we're going to kind of pull it all together and give a lot of just different areas that we need to tie in together on building that practice plan. And that's what we'll be doing in our last webinar in this series. So again, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. I appreciate you spending the last hour with me during this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to please feel free to reach out to me. I'd gladly answer any questions or go through anything that I have and be willing to share. So take care and be safe, and hope to see everybody in a couple of weeks.